Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be kind of like strapping on our strategic thinking caps. We're diving deep. Get ready for it. Into excerpts from a book on the art of war.
Oh, it's going to be good.
Yeah, we're talking about some serious military theory here.
Eh.
But don't worry, we'll make it fun, I promise. We're going to unpack all that dense language, extract the really good stuff.
Sounds like a plan.
And one of the things that really jumped out at me when I was reading this, and I know you're going to find this fascinating too, is this idea of a well-prepared defense. It's not just about sitting back and, hoping for the best.
Right. It's not about just absorbing blows. This book argues that a truly effective defense, it's almost like this coiled spring.
Yes,
Right.
exactly. It's such a great analogy. It's about being ready to strike back and actually dictate the terms of the conflict.
Absolutely. And the book really dives into some really interesting comparisons. Like
Mm.
right off the bat, it starts talking about these two main ways armies attack and defend, converging and diverging movements. And I gotta be honest, when I first read that, I was like, wait, what?
I hear you. It's one of those things that just seems so counterintuitive at first, right? Like my gut instinct says you want to concentrate your forces, right? Converge on the enemy, present this united front.
Yeah, that's what I thought too. Seems like the obvious move, right? But this book, it challenges that assumption right from the start.
So walk us through this. What's the argument for diverging, or as the book calls it, eccentric movement, being advantageous in certain situations?
Sure, so eccentric movement, in a nutshell, just means spreading out your forces. Instead of concentrating them all in one spot, you're strategically dispersing them. And the book argues that this can actually be much stronger in certain situations, particularly when you're defending a large territory. It all comes down to this concept of what it calls interior lines.
Okay, interior lines. So we're not just talking about a literal line in the sand here, right? We're
Yeah.
talking about something a little more dynamic.
Exactly. Interior lines refer to the ability to move your troops and resources more quickly and efficiently within your own territory. Think of it like having this network of back roads and shortcuts that your opponent doesn't have access to. You can reinforce your positions faster, you can outmaneuver the enemy, you can even launch surprise attacks, all while they're stuck trudging along the main roads.
Okay, I'm starting to see where this is going. It's about using your knowledge of the terrain to your advantage.
Precisely. And the book argues that this advantage in maneuverability and strategic depth, it's particularly crucial when we're talking about strategy.
Okay, so we're distinguishing here between strategy, the big picture, long-term view, and tactics, which are more about the individual battles and maneuvers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Tactics are obviously important, but it's strategy that ultimately determines who wins the war, so to speak.
And in the context of strategy, those interior lines, that ability to move swiftly within your own territory, that becomes paramount.
You got it.
So thinking about this in a historical context, are there any examples that come to mind where this kind of strategic dispersed defense really proved effective?
Oh, absolutely. A great example of this would be the Parthian Empire's success against the Romans. The Parthians, they were known for their highly mobile cavalry units, their archers, and they used this to their advantage against the Roman legions, who were much more heavily armored, much less agile.
So the Parthians, they were able to use their knowledge of the terrain, their mobility, to basically outmaneuver and exhaust the Romans.
Exactly. And it's a classic example of how sometimes spreading out your forces, embracing that eccentricity, can actually be the more effective way to defend a large territory, especially when you factor in things like supply lines and just the element of surprise.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because it really does challenge that intuitive notion that concentrating your forces is always the best strategy.
Right. It all depends on the context. And this book, it really makes you think about those assumptions, doesn't it?
It really does. And it gets even more interesting when we start digging into the specifics of how this coiled spring approach actually plays out in practice. Like, what are the elements that are crucial for making this kind of defense work?
Well, the book dives into a bunch of really interesting specifics. It starts with, well, it kind of seems obvious, but a well-trained army.
Of course, got to have that.
Right. But it emphasizes it's not just about having a huge number of soldiers.
It's about quality over quantity. Is that what they're getting at?
Yeah. It's about, making sure your soldiers are really well equipped, disciplined, and this is a big one, really know the terrain they're defending.
Ah, so it ties back into that whole strategic depth idea.
Exactly. Strategic depth. It's not just about, how much land you have behind you. It's about turning your understanding of that land into, like, a weapon.
Oh, okay. I like that. So it's almost like you're turning the whole landscape into this like multi-layered chessboard or something, right? You're using the terrain's complexities to your advantage, not just fighting on the surface.
That's a really good way to put it. And the defender, since they know the lamb so well, they have this huge advantage, right? They can kind of anticipate where the attacker's going to go, what they're going to try to do.
Set traps, create those choke points.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They can even take something that seems like a disadvantage terrain-wise and turn it around, use it to their advantage.
Okay, that's super interesting. So we've got a well-prepared army. They know the terrain like the back of their hand. What else is crucial for making this whole coiled spring defense actually work?
So then the book, it goes on to talk about fortifications.
Okay, makes sense, right? You're talking about defense, you got to have some strong fortifications.
You'd think so, but it actually gets like way more nuanced than that.
Oh, really?
Right.
More than just building a big wall and calling it a day.
Yeah, it's not just about like medieval castles or whatever, although those are cool too.
Yeah.
But the book argues that it's more strategic. Like, you got to think about where you're putting these strongholds, what purpose they're going to serve.
So they're not just about hunkering down and weathering the storm.
Not at all. They could be designed to slow down the attacker, make them commit way more resources than they were planning on.
Oh, like to break their momentum, disrupt their timetable.
Yeah. Or they could be positioned in a way that messes with the attacker's supply lines, creates all kinds of logistical nightmares.
Right, because if you can't get supplies to your troops, you're not going to be fighting very effectively for very long.
Exactly. So you see, these strongholds, they're not just about defense, really. They're also like offensive launch pads.
Oh, interesting. So it's like when the defender spots a weakness, an opportunity, they can use these strongholds to launch a counterattack, like that coiled spring releasing its energy.
Yeah, exactly. It's about being strategic,
Yeah.
choosing the right moment to strike back with maximum impact.
Okay, I'm with you. So we've got the well-trained army, the strategic fortifications. Anything else, or is that basically it for a successful coiled spring defense?
Oh, there's one more thing, and it's a big one. The book, it stresses the importance of a really resilient, resistant population.
Oh, wow, okay. Yeah, that's not something you usually think about when you're talking about military strategy, at least not directly.
Right, you think armies, fortifications, that kind of thing. But this book, it argues that a population that's united against the attacker, that's willing to resist, that can be incredibly powerful.
So it's about more than just, handing every citizen a rifle and saying good luck. It's about something deeper, a sense of shared purpose, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. It's about having that spirit of resistance, the will to fight for your home, your way of life. The book argues that this kind of popular resistance can be a huge drain on the attacker's resources, their morale.
I can imagine. Even if the attacker wins some battles, if they're constantly facing resistance from the population, it's going to take a toll.
Absolutely. It just grinds them down, wears them out.
Yeah.
And eventually, they might start to question if it's even worth it.
Right. That initial momentum they had, it starts to dissipate, and they're left with this long, drawn-out conflict that they weren't expecting.
And all the while, the defender, that coiled spring, is just waiting for the right moment to strike back, They're watching the attacker, analyzing their movements, looking for any sign of weakness.
So it becomes this really interesting psychological battle, too. Not just about brute force, but about patience, discipline, knowing when to act and when to wait.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like they're playing a game of chess on this grand scale, except the board is alive and constantly changing.
This is all so fascinating. It's really making me rethink everything I thought I knew about defense. But I'm curious, we've been talking a lot about the defender's perspective. What about the attacker facing this kind of coiled spring defense? What are some of the challenges they face? It's like we're seeing this whole other side of the conflict now. We've been so focused on the defender's strategy. But the attacker's facing a whole different set of pressures, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely. The book really drives this point home. The attacker, they often go into this whole thing with this expectation of a swift victory.
Right, like overwhelming force, shock, and awe, that kind of thing.
Exactly. They've poured all these resources, manpower, everything into this offensive. They're expecting a quick, decisive win.
And when that doesn't happen, when they come up against this coiled spring defense that we've been talking about,
that's when things get really interesting and really dangerous for the attacker. Because that momentum they were counting on, it starts to stall. And all of a sudden, they're bogged down in this protracted conflict that they weren't prepared for.
it becomes a war of attrition.
Exactly. And the defender, they're using that to their advantage. They know the terrain, they can draw on local support, they can wait for the attacker to make a mistake.
And the attacker, they're stuck in this unfamiliar environment. Their supply lines are stretched thin. Their morale is starting to waver.
And all the while, that coiled spring is still there, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back.
So it's not just about absorbing the blow. It's about knowing when and where to hit back with maximum impact.
Precisely. The defender, they're dictating the terms of the engagement. They're not just reacting to the attacker, they're making the attacker react to them.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. It really makes you realize that there's so much more to defense than just building walls and hoping for the best.
I know, it's about strategy, it's about resilience, it's about understanding the psychologies of your opponent.
It's about using everything at your disposal, the terrain, your resources, even the will of your people, to create this multi-layered, dynamic defense that can withstand even the most overwhelming attack.
And ultimately, that's what makes this coiled spring analogy so powerful. It's not just about defense, really. It's about harnessing that defensive energy, that resilience, and turning it into a force for victory.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. So, for everyone listening, we'll leave you with this. Think about the coiled spring approach. Where else in your own lives, in your work, your relationships, even your personal challenges, could that kind of strategic patience, that willingness to wait for the right moment to act, lead to surprising and powerful results? Until next time, keep those strategic minds engaged.
See you on the next deep dive.